Started here. That's probably loud enough, isn't it? There was Hezekiah, so proud of the things that he had, so proud of the temple, so proud of all the gold and the silver, showing it to this envoy from Babylon, that they wanted to see. And so he showed him all these things. And then, of course, Isaiah would walk in later and say, "Did you show him everything?" "Oh, yes, I did. Yes, I did." He said, "Yeah, they're going to come back. And everything you have is going to be carried off to Babylon. Your sons will be made eunuchs in the palace of Babylon." Those kind of prophecies from God seem, as devastating as they are, it's kind of hard to imagine any good coming out of something like that. And we read Ezekiel in the very beginning, and we talked about the anger and the wrath of God and the things that were going to befall Israel. And even the personal prophecies about the young men in the palace of Babylon brings us some of the greatest stories, the most uplifting and encouraging messages that God can give us as a people. I'm not really sure where we'd be without Daniel, but I know the world would be a much darker and emptier place. For me, this has been a fantastic to study about a young man who was so stalwart, so strong, to be able to stand up in adversity at such a young age and be able to make up his mind where he purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's meat or the wine in which he drank. So much so that we don't even know what that defilement is. Depending upon what commentary you read, then you'll come up with all kind of ideas. You have an idea, I have an idea, but you know what? God doesn't even tell us. He just said there was a young man who purposed in his heart he wasn't going to defile himself. And that's significant. A young man that had been gone away and taken away into captivity and mutilated to a point that he could have made any excuse he wanted to make to rationalize and justify. Well, you know what? Things are different right now. It doesn't really matter if I eat a pig or not. I can't even go to the temple anymore. Or if it had been something else like meat offered up to idols or something like that. Well, God, I'm sure you'll understand. I'm in a really bad strait right here. I don't really want to anger anybody. But that wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Daniel and his friends. And it amazes me that we follow this young man in his career, but I think it's summed up here in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 12, just a passage that is now starting to be very near and dear to my heart as I go through this wonderful book. And that is that this angel is talking to Daniel and he says, "Fear not. Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you purposed in your heart, the first day that you set your heart on understanding and you humbled yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I'm come for your word's sake." Does that not encapsulate everything about man's responsibility in the relationship to God? That you would set your heart on understanding what God's will and ways are, and the nature of man, to stay out of all of the entrapments and the encumberments that seem to befall us all the time, but to set your heart on the understanding and then humble yourself before your God. And when that happened, the great creator, eternal God of all time had a special relationship with Daniel where his words were heard. The verse just previous to this, in verse 11, is something where the angel actually says, "O Daniel, thou man greatly beloved." Could you imagine someday being able to have that conversation, that heavenly conversation where that your name is called and in that particular manner? I've always thought Moses had a great relationship, and I've been envious of that. And yet here's one with this man Daniel where he says, "Oh man, greatly beloved." All the host of heaven knew who Daniel was long before we did. And Daniel would stand so firm and so strong, even when he was faced with such adversities that the decree was signed. And when he knew the decree was signed and he knew what was coming his way, he went to that same place where the carpet was wore out by his knees, the same window where he would done, because that was his life. And he would get down on his knees and he prayed like time before. And he would just stand just completely unruffled in front of that lion's den. Come what may. What a man. If I were to ask you and say, in your mind's eye, can you describe to me what a strong man is? A man's man. Oh, I've got all kind of images. You know, we watch all kind of gladiator movies. And what's a man's man? And Ainsley and I were watching one the other day with Clark Gable, you know. A man's man, like the John Wayne. Not Daniel. You see, he was castrated in the prime of his life when those hormones were going to do things for him. The eunuchs that were in the palace of Tunis when during the Barbary Coast Wars, those individuals had effeminate characteristics. Their voices were high and pitched. They had never developed properly because they were deprived of the hormones that God had provided in the body. That would have been Daniel. Not somebody you would have looked at and said, well, here's a strong man. But much like when Elisha said, Lord, open the servant's eyes that he may see. And God opened his eyes and he looked around and he saw the chariots of fire round about. And if God could open our eyes and we could look at the character of a man, we would see the rock of Gibraltar, a man chiseled out of marble. That would be our Daniel. You know, not all adversity creates character. We say that. We say adversity creates character. That's not actually true. At any institutional level, from the family on up to the community or armies or whatever, it's not just adversity, but you have to have a moral framework to begin with. You see, I can be an alcoholic father and I could beat my kids silly and it's not going to give them any character whatsoever. But if they start off with a moral framework, adversity builds character. That's the way God works. And that character being built that way is a lifestyle. But you have to start with that moral framework. And then that adversity. It reminds me of the word we've talked about several times, which is the word patience, which I'm kind of getting intrigued with in the Bible. The word patience, you know, has always kind of bothered me where it was thrown in, and I start looking at it, and I've told you it's not about waiting. That word patience in the Greek language, that's about endurance. And it's not about enduring something just because I can't get out of it. I've got pain where I can't do anything about it. My captors are more powerful than I am. That's not the kind of enduring. It's the kind of enduring that you choose to say, oh yes, Nebuchadnezzar, you asked us who is able to deliver us. Well, our God whom we serve is able. But if not, if we go into the fiery furnace and it's gone tomorrow, we will not bow down. It's that kind of endurance. It's endurance, the affliction that you choose to endure. And that's Daniel. Years ago at officer training school, we had this saying. We would say, watch your thoughts. We'd tell the cadets, watch your thoughts because your thoughts become words. And watch your words because they become your actions. And watch your actions because they become habits. And watch your habits because they become your character. Character is something that just day in and day out. You may be able to look at me and really not know my character either until their adversity comes along. It's nothing that you can lie about. It's nothing that you could just wish away or wish for. It's just, character is one of those things that, you've either built it and it's ready when the time is right or not, but it's an entire life. For instance, years ago, 1965, we didn't know much about what was going on in Vietnam, but they sent in the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cav into a little landing zone called X-Ray. Nothing had been happening there, kind of a sleepy little place, little mountain there in a valley, and it would become known as the Ai Drang Valley. And as they went in there, they were going to kind of poke around a little bit, just see what was happening, a little scouting mission, get involved and kind of train the troops up and get them ready for real battle. What they didn't know is they had landed on a North Vietnamese Army regimental headquarters, which was honeycombed throughout that mountain. So what then ensued over the next several days has been made into a movie, We Were Soldiers. Mel Gibson playing Hal Moore. General Hal Moore would come by Army War College, and he would always say this. He goes, the best company commander I ever saw in the Army in my entire career was a guy named Rick Rescorla. Rick Rescorla was from London, and he had come over to get involved in this conflict, and so he was a company commander. And so when they realized what had happened and they started taking heavy losses and companies were surrounded and they were just getting decimated, he said he just kept stepping up time and time again, saving everybody. And at one time, they knew that the entire North Vietnamese army, that regiment, was going to make a frontal attack at night. And they were getting ready out there with their fires and their whoops and hollers and all the banging and everything else. And the troops were just sitting there trembling, knowing they just didn't have the firepower maybe to stave it off. This would be their last night. They said Rick Rescorla stood up. He started singing, and he was walking around, and he put his hand on his troops. He'd start talking to them, asking them how they were doing. And he was singing an old Cornish folk song, a mining song, going up Clamboard Hill, coming down. And he would do that through the rest of the war, and he was just known as just an incredible individual that was, never just fleeing from fire, and his courage was contagious. And he was the reason many of those individuals years later would break down in tears and say, I would have never survived. Rick Rescorla went on to retire as a colonel, and then he was the vice president of security for J.P. Morgan and Dean Witter until September 11th, 2001. When those jets hit the towers, everybody was in a panic, and they started collapsing, and the stairwells were filled with smoke. Rick Rescorla took 2,300 people down those stairwells and led them out to safety. And then he turned around and went back in. He began to lead others back down, and he would take people that were in such confusion and panic, and he would lead them out of the towers, and then he'd go back in. At the very end, when the floors below the 10th floor started to collapse, the people that made it out said, there's a man up there fitting his description, leading everybody, and God bless America. And some say, well, he walked through the dark, fiery halls, and he was singing an old Cornish folk song, going up Clamboard Hill, coming down. The last calls Rick would make were to his wife and one of his buddies from Vietnam. They had no idea who he was until that moment. We would never know about Daniel and his friends until these moments. Put into the fiery furnace, put into the test of the anvil, and yet comes out to us and preaches to us about the way Christians and God's people are supposed to be. How we're supposed to be prepared for these very things. I know David's going to go over Daniel 9, and after the job that he did on Daniel 6, I know it'll be a fantastic job, and Johnny stood in for a very, very difficult chapter. In fact, David had 6 and Johnny had 7, and then Johnny stood up here and said, well, David chose 6, and he gave me this very difficult chapter 7. So I kind of want to clear the air on all that. The way that happened was exactly the way Johnny said it. David took the easy chapter and left Johnny with the chapter 7. But they both did a fantastic job, and I know he's going to go over this prayer. We were talking earlier in the class about how to memorize and how to fit things together in your mind and how it should couple. And Daniel 9 you can think of as an incredible prayer of a godly man, somebody that just seems to be beyond our imagination. But there's also another prayer in the Bible that is very, very uncannily similar to it. It's Nehemiah 9. If you were to look at those passages and start reading Nehemiah 9 next to Daniel 9, it's a real eye-opener. But Daniel says some things here that are really those overarching principles. And we've talked about the themes of Daniel, right? There's a theme there about the coming kingdom in the days of those kings, the Roman kings. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Nor shall the sovereignty thereof be left to another people, and break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. And it shall stand forever. And that kingdom, he gives us a timeline. There's a 70-week timeline. There's a 2,300-day timeline that's given to us about what I think is Antiochus Epiphanes and all these timelines and prophecies leading up. And there's some messianic prophecies as well. But there's also some other themes in there as well, aren't there? Daniel chapter 4 and verse 17, when he said it's the sentence of the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living know that the God of heaven is in control and sets up kingdoms. He reigns over the kingdoms of men, and he giveth it to whomsoever he will, and he sets up over it the lowest of men. That's a theme in Daniel. But there's also some more subtle kind of undercurrents here. And if in Daniel 9:14, if you look at this, it says, therefore hath Jehovah watched over the evil, and he brought it upon us. Well, we're not skeptics. We're not silly. We're not going to run off with that word evil and start talking about who God is. We know what he's talking about. We're talking about the suffering and calamities in this life. But we'd be naive to think that God doesn't bring those upon people when he needs to, and we'll find out why he needs to, but it says he brought it upon us. For, that word for, it's underlined, means because. Now notice this, because Jehovah our God is righteous. You see, I thought when I read this for the first time, I said, because Jehovah our God, he's angry, he's wrathful, of course he is. But then I had to stand up, wait a minute, let me read that again. It's not that he's not full of wrath. It's not that he doesn't have that, but it says he did it because of his righteousness. He brought calamity on his people because he's righteous. And because they have what? Not obeyed his voice. So if you were to take this sentence right here and you were just to kind of draw a line throughout the Bible, it would be a continuous theme from the very beginning to the end. There's consequences to actions, and God's righteous, and it demands action. God's righteousness demands justice, not our justice, not a vengeful justice, not a social justice, not a way the things I want it to be in my corrupt heart, but a righteous justice that is demanded by God, and that same righteousness demands humble obedience. And that's what we read about in the book of Daniel. A man on his knees coming to God and before God, always in humility and humbleness. God's righteousness demands action by both God and man. And then in verse 18, we read this. Incline your ear, hear, open your eyes. Behold our desolations, the city which is called by thy name. And we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousness, but for thy great mercy's sake. We nonetheless present our supplications. Even for his mercy's sake, it requires a broken heart and a contrite spirit, according to the psalmist in Psalms 34. Sometimes I think, and as we go into this, I want you to think, maybe possibly, we have misconstrued Hebrews 10, 19, other passages, I believe in Hebrews, I think it's chapter 4, verse 16. We pray that we boldly come before his throne of grace. We boldly approach him to enter into the holy place. I think that's taken out of context. I think what he's saying there, the Hebrew writer is saying, with absolute surety and confidence in the blood of Christ, that he has enabled us to enter the holy place. That we are before and in God's presence in absolute confidence for the blood of Christ. But boldly, I don't see one individual in the Bible with boldly, with chin uplifted. I see them on their knees in humility. And that's when God answers and responds, when you humble yourself before your God. And in those prayers like Nehemiah 9 and Daniel 9, those are the most humble prayers that you can read. There's no boldness in it about the individual himself. Here we find Nebuchadnezzar. This is kind of a commentary in chapter 5 about what happened in chapter 4. And this is Daniel when he's an old man. He's a forgotten old man, except for by the queen. We'll talk about that later if we have time. He'll be brought in, and he's talking to Belshazzar, and he says this. He says, but when his heart, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather certainly, he says, when it was lifted up and the spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly. That's why those things came to him, because he was proud. He was proud and lifted himself up, and he was deposed. And it would be, a common theme that we've talked about, 2 Chronicles 26 and Uzziah. He said as long as he sought after God, he did that which was right in God's eyes, God increased his power, and God helped him exceedingly. And he was able to put down the Philistines. He was able to put down the Ammonites. He was able to put down these individuals like the Arabs. And he fought all of those battles until the dust started to settle. And then he started building, didn't he? And Uzziah was great and powerful. And it said he made a great name for himself. And it went all the way into Egypt. And it said, and God helped him exceedingly. But when he was great, then we want our young people to know what comes next. Oh, his heart was lifted up. And he did that which was abominable by walking into and burning unauthorized things on the altar. Common theme throughout the Bible. Unfortunately, it's a common theme in mankind. Lifting our heart up. You know, it reminds me, we had kind of a sermon, I think last year or something, we were talking about Deuteronomy chapter 8. The whole passage is so much incredible. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, remember, he's trying to tell them, he says, don't forget the God of heaven in not keeping his commandments or his statutes and ordinances which I command thee this day. Because when you've eaten and you're full, you're no longer hungry. You're not whining in the wilderness, but I've given you all these things. But when you're eating and you're full, and when you've built goodly houses and you dwell therein, and when your herds and your flocks have increased and multiplied, and the silver and the gold have multiplied, and all that thou hast has multiplied, he says, then you forget Jehovah your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of bondage. That's the sad case of nature of man right there. The sad case for all of us. And they had to be reminded again and again. And later on in that very same chapter, he said, lest you forget. And you say, by my power, I've done these things. By my power, I've gotten this wealth. And he says, no, it's Jehovah God that gave you the power to gain this wealth. And so we find Nebuchadnezzar, as we said, a man here that is kind of an enigma in some ways. In chapter 2, he says he realizes that the God of Daniel is different, that those individuals there, that he was only the one that was able to interpret dreams. And I think Johnny did a really great, subtle point about that, about the interpretation of dreams being, if Daniel had the gift to interpret dreams that were symbolic and apocalyptic kind of in nature, then can we do that in uninspired writings? You know, I mean, you have to proceed with such caution, but that would be for another day when we talk about dispensationalism. It's like, well, do you have a Daniel in your midst? Then likely we ought to shut our mouths about what's happening, because Daniel was given a gift, and even Daniel that had the inspiration of interpretation of dreams is going to end up with a lot of dreams and visions where he says, I don't know, I don't understand. And he was in a much different position than we are. And yet today we have all kind of people read these visions and go, I know what it means. It means the Russians are going to marry up with the Iranians, and then they're going to come down from the north, and they're going to have these helicopters, and all these things are going to happen. I think, how foolish. We make ourselves look in front of the world. But Nebuchadnezzar is going to go chapter 3. He's going to, who is able? And he's going to find out it's the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So he's going to change his tune, isn't he? And he's going to say, well, nobody say anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because he showed some real power. But he's still not there yet, is he? And then in chapter 4, we start reading the words that probably could be written by any prophet that we know of. But it's Nebuchadnezzar, and we're like, what happened? What's happened with Nebuchadnezzar? God had some plans for him, and he had that dream, and he explained it to Daniel. And at the end of that dream, of course, he said it was a sense of the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. He's going to find that out. Later on, Daniel here in verse 32 is going to tell him, you're going to be given a beast's heart. You're going to be driven. You're going to be eating grass as ox. And oh, by the way, till 7 times passes over you. I wonder if Nebuchadnezzar thought back and thought, oh yeah, I remembered in my fury, I said, take that furnace and light it up and make it 7 times hotter until they get the message. And now God says, oh, you'll get the message 7 times for you, Nebuchadnezzar, till you know. And he was given the heart of a beast. Now, in 1946, we had an individual that apparently was in this, one of the sanitariums over there in England after the war, and he actually thought he was an animal of the field, and he would go out, and they couldn't get him indoors, and he would live outside on the grass, and he ate grass. His hair was long, he was dirty, his claws came out, and they said he was just like an animal. And they had a name for it, this particular condition. But, I'm not one to say that we need to find a natural condition for everything God said. God said you're going to eat grass, you're going to eat grass. It doesn't matter if there's a condition or not. He said you're going to have a heart of a beast, you're going to have the heart of a beast regardless. But it has happened, and we have noticed that if you go into the major cities of today, you can see Nebuchadnezzar. I've seen them on their hair's like eagle feathers, and they've been out in the street all night long, and their claws are long and dirty, and they've come up with a little sign. But I know they've got some intelligence because it says, money for mushrooms, please. When they take that heart of the beast, and that's when you can find a video online of a girl taking a bowling ball and throwing it up against another girl's head, or taking her down and bashing her brains in on a sidewalk. We know what a heart of the beast is. We know what happens. When mankind turns away from his God, he starts acting like the animals of the field. And there's no saving them, but an accountability before our great and mighty Creator. Tommy Thompson was talking about that city council meeting. Disappointing to think that they have to sit around and act like they don't know what's wrong and that they need the answers to what's happening. And Tommy was trying to be nice. He said, well, it's my opinion that it starts in the home. And I'm going to just disagree with Tommy. He was absolutely right, but it's not his opinion. That's what God's book says. God's book says in Proverbs 29, if you spare the rod and correction from a child, that's good things and it gives wisdom. That rod of correction gives wisdom, which is what we lack. And it says, but a child left to himself is a shame to his mother. Oh, a child left to raise themselves will begin to act like the beast in the field. And short of changing the family, like Tommy had pointed out, until we de-incentivize this ridiculous nonsense of the fatherless home, which you could trace to every one of these social ills, if we're not going to put the father back in the home, then those kids better learn pretty early in some fashion, and that's the school system. So when Johnny goes to school, he ought to know what it's like. If he steals somebody's lunch money when he's 8 years old, he ought to feel a paddle across his backside. That didn't kill us. And when he's 12, he shouldn't see somebody in his class curse the teacher out and scream her out and everything, so the teacher's in tears and nothing can happen. Because by the time that student is 16 years old, he's going to take his fist, drive it across the jaw of a female teacher in this city and put her in the hospital, and she's going to have physical therapy, and the kids are going to see him in class next day, but she's gone. Are you telling me, city council, you don't know what to do? By the time Johnny shoots a woman out here at 23 years old, it's too late. You're not going to hang him from the yardarm a week later, which he should be in the town square. But Johnny's gone, but his cousin is not. And he's 8 years old, and he needs discipline. He needs to learn how to respect authority. Because by the time he's running with gangs as a teenager and he's just running amok, society's going to continue to pay the price. The heart of a beast. God says he's in control. But he's given us freedom of choice. There's consequences to our actions, and he allows things to run their course many times. Even in verse 35 there, he says he's in control at the individual level. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And who can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? Which is what Job is all about. You quit your questions and you glorify God. Why? Because of who he is. And we're going to find out that's exactly what happens in chapter 5. It's not about being a good person. It's about not what you haven't done until you talk about glorifying God. It's not good enough that you can go out and just be a good person. You missed the point of the whole thing. If we have time, we'll talk about that in a second here. Let me give you an example. We talked about Romans 13. I want to give you one more example, so maybe this will soak in. This is in Acts chapter 23. Paul said, I don't care what they do to me to Jerusalem. I'm going anyway. So he goes to Jerusalem, and sure enough, he runs into some big trouble. They start beating on him there, and it's the chief of the captain. He actually has to get saved that way, and to protect him, like many times in history, he's put in jail. And while he's there, he's using the privileges of his citizenship, and he finds out about this plot against him. They're going to murder him when they bring him out, and they're going to feign all of these things like they want to talk, but they've taken an oath that they're going to kill him. And he's going to send his nephew over to the chief captain, the chief guard, and he's going to say, why don't you tell him these things? And he's going to request that they're able to take him to Caesarea and protect him. They're going to protect him through violent force, oh, by the way, because that's how you meet violence. And he's going to use that because he's a citizen. And you can't ask other people to do what you cannot do immorally. If it's immoral for you, it's immoral for them. But it wasn't immoral for Paul, so he asked them to do it because they were trained and ready with the sword to protect him and take his rights. But oh, by the way, this is the kicker. The night before Jesus Christ, I suppose that's him, the Lord had appeared unto him and said, Paul, take heart, take courage, because as you've testified before me in Jerusalem, so shall you be witness to me in Rome. Because in chapter 9, remember when he got his commission, he told Ananias, oh, he will testify for me in front of kings. By the way, which king did Paul ever convert? Not the point, is it? You stand up where you're told to stand up. You're a witness for Jesus Christ. When you were a witness, they were eyewitnesses. They were supposed to do it regardless of the outcome. They were supposed to sow the seed. They were supposed to testify to the validity of the scriptures, and that's exactly what they did. But he was promised by Jesus that he would go to Rome. The Lord told me that night. The next day, I find out somebody's ready to kill me, and instead of sitting back going, well, you know what? God's got big plans for me, and it's all in his hands. We hear that all the time from our young preachers around here. I'm getting tired of it. Paul had to do something and act like a citizen and act like somebody that was active about to save his own life. Because God works through people. Even through the heathen chief captain. Even to those soldiers. He was going to get him escorted safely to a place where finally he would get to Rome. Not on his terms, not like he thought, but he would get there. God expects you to do your job. Not sit back with some kind of apathetic thing of watching society and communities and families falling apart all around us and act like, well, God's in control. He's in control, and he's wondering why we're not doing anything. He works through people. Always has. Always will. This is the nature of man. Even after the warning, Nebuchadnezzar says, look at this great Babylon, which I have built. Look at the royal dwelling place, the might of my power and of the glory of my majesty. While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. He probably cringed. Oh, no. They told me. He said, the kingdom's taken from you. While the words were in his mouth. You know, I've looked at this before and think, I can't imagine, how dense can you be to have been warned, to have seen these visions, to have Daniel come in and interpret it, and then later on when things are going so well, you go, look at what I've done. By my power, I've accomplished all these things. I think, what's the matter with him? Is he mentally ill? I'd confess to you, I can't imagine anybody sitting in this auditorium that hasn't done this. In other words, is this an extraordinary statement? No. No, see, that's the pain of it all. It's not an extraordinary statement. I've done this numerous times. God's been good to me. He's blessed me with all kinds of things. I found myself in all kinds of situations, even where I've walked off later and went, wait a minute. I didn't give God credit one bit. There I was. I had eaten and I was full. My flocks and my herds, they had multiplied. The silver and gold I had gathered unto myself, and I was living in a goodly house, and there it was with my power and my might. I can't imagine us saying we haven't been here. That's what this is for. It's not to show you that Nebuchadnezzar was some kind of strange being that we can't relate to. He's trying to say, this is the way people are. And he's begging us to stay on our knees and stay humble before our God and give credit to him. He says, remember, it's Jehovah thy God that giveth thee the power to gain wealth. But the Israelites wouldn't learn. Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't learn. Sometimes I haven't learned. And in the end, Nebuchadnezzar does learn. It says when his heart comes back to him, when he's given that heart back, he's given an understanding. And when the understanding of a real human being understanding of his place in the world, he says this about the great and almighty God. Think about this. What great things God was able to accomplish. All according to his prophecies, but through young individuals that had their entire world collapse around them. Their entire world collapse around them. Now, you could go either way when that happens. Probably dependent upon how far you've already stepped away from God. And I could question God and get a little bitter and a little angry and wonder why this is happening, or you could be like those young men and not think another thing about it and just go on your knees, going straight forward, and then end up in a stand like nobody's ever seen before. And then God was able to use them and bring about all of these wonderful things. And he would have done it. In history, he will bring about the things he needs to bring about, but then we would wonder why they weren't able to be used by God. But they were. And they could have thought, God's in control. I'm certainly not going to put my neck on the line. God will bring about what he needs to bring about. Why did God bother with Nebuchadnezzar? You ever answer that question? Why did God bother with a pagan, idolatrous king? Was it going to change Babylon? I didn't change it. It didn't change it for very long. Didn't change it at all. But he used Daniel and his friends, and it ended up being very different. Sorry the way this slide turned out. I would have been remiss just to say, realize we've done something in this class that's probably a foul. You could either go through Daniel chronologically, which I recommend, or you could go through it numerically and just go, 1 through 12. We haven't done either, have we? We're not chronological, and we haven't done it numerically, so you just figure it out. Well, anyway, the first 4 chapters, they're in chronological order. You can go 1 through 4, that's it. But then after that, it's 7, 8, 5, and 6. Pretty sure. 7, 8, and 5, and 6. And so if you were to read it chronologically and try to look at it instead of getting confused with who's in power and what's happening. And then after that, the last 4 are a little bit more jumbled, and so much so that they fell off the slide, but it's a little bit more difficult to tell. In chapter 5, we do see this. This is one of the culminating parts of the Babylonian Empire. This is the last night. This is when Cyrus has risen to power. And this is when that night he's up on the Euphrates River with his army, and they're about to cut the dikes, they're about to divert the water, and they're about to go walking under it. And they said when they got to Babylon, there was a huge party going on, and everybody was in festivities. Now, the Bible told us that there's a party going on in the palace of 1,000 lords, and if you add the wives and the concubines, you're probably going to get 2,000 to 3,000 people in the palace alone. So everybody's in this drunken kind of spree, and this is what's happening, but there's a candlestick and a writing on the wall, and then Daniel's unknown. You ever thought about that? Poor Daniel. He's done his thing. He's stood his ground. He's done everything he can, but somewhere in there, he's put out to pasture. Somewhere in there, maybe he's put out in another kingdom. When he had a vision, he was in the vision. In chapter 8, he was over in Elam, or the old Elamite kingdom, over by Susa, but he was in the vision then. But maybe Maybe he had been doing a little traveling. Maybe he was out of sorts. But we see the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar doesn't seem to be recognizing Daniel, doesn't seem to know him, but a queen does. And she's not part of that drunken spree. So you think she's probably a grandmother queen. She may have been one of the wives of Nebuchadnezzar. She may have been his daughter. She may have been the mother of Belshazzar. Either way, she does. And she reminds him about this man, and he's brought in to tell him. And what's really amazing is this passage right here. You've not humbled your heart. Even though you knew all this about your grandfather, you knew he was driven out. You knew there was something peculiar. You knew he had changed his heart. But you still rose up and lifted yourself against the Lord of heaven. So they're hearing this drinking out of all of these things, and they're praising the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, stone, wood, and stone. And he says, but they don't see, they don't hear, they don't know. But the God in whose hand thy very breath is. You know, my mother taught me this when I was a young man. Probably 8 years old or something in one of her classes, and she taught me this verse. I wish it would have stuck a little bit better for a long time, but I've never forgotten it. But the God in whose hand your very breath is, and who has all your ways, you have not glorified. You know, I use this a lot when I'm flying over the Atlantic and somebody says, well, I'm religious, I believe. But I could tell by their lifestyle that they haven't changed anything. It doesn't matter to them. Oh, they believe. And we've said that about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they felt the heat of the fire and they're dragged up to it. God's going to put this world in a situation where faith only is not going to matter. You're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to obey and die, or you're going to have to go ahead and recant and live. Or you compromise your faith and live. And that's when you don't want to be next to a group of people that are faith only. You're like, that's not going to help you. You're going to have to make a decision. And that's where God brings people all the time. Why would it be so, vastly beyond our understanding that he would bring you to a decisive point of obedience, even in conversion itself? But you notice that last line, thou hast not glorified. That's what it's all about. Regardless of what he's done, what he hasn't done, where you think you are in your life, how downtrodden you've been or how lifted up you've been. But somewhere in there, all the way through to the end of your life, you've got to make up your mind. It's not about assent. He doesn't want your mental assent. He doesn't want your acquiescence. He wants a glorification from you. And if you're not living in that, that means a living sacrifice. Your life is dead. That's something that you let go of. And everything about your life is centered on this one thing, and that is the glorification of God. And Daniel says, you can do it. I did it. And I'm waiting to meet you to talk about it. Thank you so much. Oceans in his hand, who has numbered every grain of sand. King and nations tremble at his voice. All creation rises to rejoice. Who has given counsel to the Lord? Who can question any of his words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deeds? Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has felt the nails upon his hand, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humble to the grave. Jesus, Savior, risen now to reign. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. You will reign forever. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Behold our God, seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him.
Good morning, church. It is great to see everyone this morning. I'm doing announcements this month, and I'm also preaching today. So you're going to hear and see a lot of me this morning. I apologize. Tonight, we are having a hot dog meal and a kickball game tonight. So make sure tonight you wear your finest kickball shoes. Don't forget that. Also, make sure you bring a lawn chair for this evening and stay hydrated. It is getting hotter, and we're not used to it. Okay, so don't forget about that. That'll be a lot of fun. That's going to be right after evening services tonight. Important Del Rey Youth Group event coming up. We have our youth group initiation May 18th. It's going to be hosted by the Randolphs at their place. So for all those newcomers into the youth group and families, so congratulations, and I pray that that's going to be awesome. Okay, we have I have quite a few announcements, so I'm going to try to get through these as quick as I can. On May 19th, we're going to have a special speaker, Kyle Butt. You may have heard of him. He's going to be talking about having a heart of